Bueno, pues
Welcome again to all of you.
second session of the first day of the conference. Today we are very glad and we are very thankful to present Professor Joanna Bourke and that she finally has been able to join us and to be here with us. It's always such a pleasure to read her and to share with her the ideas and reflections. I'm going to do like a very brief introduction of her trajectory, which I think we all really already know, but well, just for someone that doesn't know. She's a Professor Emerita of History at Birkbeck at the University of London, also Professor Emerita of Rhetoric at Gresham College. She's a Fellow of the British Academy and she has written several books and articles on war, sexual violence, emotions from mainly a cultural perspective, such as the last one is a book called Disgrace, Global Reflections on Sexual Violence, or a book that I really enjoyed and has been essential to my own research and my own work, An Intimate History of Killing, Face-to-Face Killing in 20th Century Warfare, que está traducido al castellano como Sed de Sangre, Historia Íntima del Combate Cuerpo a Cuerpo en las Guerras del siglo XX. And from what I have been able to read, she's currently working on a quite intriguing topic on the nature of evil and femininity, which I think will lead to another great book. And the lecture that she's going to present today is entitled Cultures of Harm, Gender and the Politics of Wartime Violence. So, Joanna, the floor is yours whenever you want.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen here so that you can all see. Great. Perfect. Look, thank you very much for allowing me to speak today. And I want to apologize that family disaster means I can't be there in person, which I really deeply regret. But thank you very much for coming. As Miguel already said, I want to talk to you today about cultures of harm, gender, and the politics of wartime violence. I mean, as everyone here in this room will know, fear, distress, pain, grief, these are the overriding emotions experienced by people in wartime. But for those lucky enough to be at a distance from the killing fields, exhilarating surges of patriotic energies, the evaporation of many social restraints, really kind of are fleeting thrills when set against the loss of loved ones. Children, of course, wake up to find that their fathers have left for distant battlefields while they slept. Many never saw their fathers again. Millions of mothers, wives, and sisters received the dreadful telegram informing them that their loved ones had been killed. And when I was starting to do this work, there was a letter I read, and I've quoted it a number of times because it really was the letter that got me thinking about some of the things I want to talk about today. And that is a letter by or from a woman called Phyllis Kelly. She first heard that her lover, Eric Appleby, had been seriously wounded. When this happened, she went and she set pen to paper. And the date is the 28th of October, 1915. And this is what she wrote. She wrote, "My own darling Englishman," she's writing from Dublin, "I wonder why I am writing this, which you may never see. Oh God, perhaps even now you have gone far away from your lady. I wonder when another telegram will come. This knowing nothing is terrible. I don't know what to do. I simply have sat and shivered with such an awful clutching fear at my heart. You are all the world and life to me." And the only reason we have her letter, Phyllis Kelly's letter, is because, of course, it was never posted. Eric was already dead. But in this talk, I want to explore such emotional narratives and the challenges I think that they present to us. It's going to be the main argument of this talk that we cannot understand violence in modern warfare. And I'm going to be looking at First World War to Iraq without understanding gender, by which I mean masculinity, of course, as well as femininity, although I've been asked to speak about femininity for this talk. I mean, I think it's a really sorry fact that despite knowing that community, communion are at the heart of what it means to be human, nevertheless, in every period of history, in every culture, the fleshy vulnerability of other sentient beings can incite aggression. These sentient beings are always gendered. Gender is one of the ways we make sense of the world around us. And importantly, I think that gender cannot be understood without those other intersecting identities. Most obviously, class, racialization, religion, age, generation, disability, and so on and so on. Today, however, my work is going to start from the premise that it is not possible to understand how and why violence is used as a tool of oppression without understanding gendered bodies. So, what I'm saying here is that wartime attacks on physiological, on symbolic, and on ideological bodies are attentive to particular gender formulations within temporal, spatial, and geopolitical contexts. These formulations also change with formidable speed, and I would say that because, of course, I'm an historian, and that's what interests me. In other words, what I'm saying here is that the gender and politics of wartime aggression are not incidental to the violence; they are integral to the labor of harming itself. Violence relies on symbols, ideologies, expectations, practices. Because violence is embodied in gendered bodies, it is lived as well as felt. Historically, gender has been really crucial in that binary, the very common binary that we all know about between perpetrators and victims. And I have problems with that binary, but we can talk about them later if you like. The gender contract, so-called gender contract, in which adult male subjects were expected to inflict and experience wounding and death in exchange for certain rights, such as the rights to vote, or patriarchal privileges, has been, however, progressively undermined in the new military order. This is not to say that women and children have not always been victims of choice. In the modern period, we just have to think of imperial invasions, from the European military conquest of indigenous America to, of course, the formidable expansion of British and European empires in the 19th century. During the 20th century, however, women and children were the preeminent victims. And I've given this statistic before. World War One, 5% of deaths were of civilians. By the Second World War, that is 66%. In the 1939 to 45 war, considerably more civilians than military personnel were killed in Belgium, China, France, Greece, Hungary, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, and the Soviet Union. Targeting decisions were also gendered. Male competence target men because of their sex, but they also target women because of their sex. In other words, girls and women with a focus of gender-specific violence, in particular sexual violence. In armed conflicts, the sexualized violence has served a lot of different functions. It has been, for example, a political strategy. And here I'm thinking about followers of Aristide in Haiti or supporters of the Pakistan People's Party. It's been a weapon wielded by one ethnic group against Another, the Chinese in Indonesia, the Ogoni in Nigeria, the Tutsis in Rwanda. It's been a way of collecting information during interrogations. It's functioned for example, Peru's counterinsurgency force, and a way of wreaking religious vengeance against Muslim and Croats in the former Yugoslavia, as well as against Muslims in India and Myanmar. Now, during the First World War, the most thoroughly documented instances of mass rape took place in Belgium and Russia. Then, from the 1930s, rape and enforced prostitution were a major feature in the Japanese invasion of China. The misnamed comfort stations were populated by around 160,000 girls and women. They were military sexual slaves, 80% Korean, but also Filipino, Chinese, Taiwanese, Indonesian, Dutch, and Japanese women were also subjected to this form of abuse. Notorious mass rapes took place in Germany, Russia, Korea, China, Japan, Italy, and the Philippines. In Berlin, for example, 1 in every 3 women were raped, and over 100,000 died as a result of sexual assault. Thousands committed suicide. Crucially, rape was systemic. It has been sometimes, quite often, genocidal. Now, I think a particularly powerful evocation of this can be seen in art. And here in particular, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about art in this talk. Here in particular, I'm thinking about Judy Chicago's artwork called Double Jeopardy. Judy Chicago was appalled by the allegorical uses or approaches to violence against women, particularly in art. And she accused art historians for rhapsodically, I don't know if that's even a word, but anyway, that's what she said, praising the brushwork, for example, of Rubens' painting, while paying no attention to the way it glorifies rape. Now, for feminist artists like Chicago, rape demonstrated the corrupt and putrid masculinity that it was at the heart of militarism. Although her aim was, she put it, to make visible women's distinctive suffering in wartime, she did recognize that wartime brutality was a continuum of peacetime cruelty. And I'm going to be coming back to that point in a few moments. So in her artwork, Double Jeopardy, which you can see here on the screen, Chicago set out to portray how women during the Holocaust were doubly victimized. And I think that's a really interesting term which we can talk about. Doubly victimized. They were persecuted because they were Jews. They were raped because they were women. Her artistic challenge was to establish women's unique predicament. She observed that victims of the Holocaust were usually represented through photographs and through film, both of which routinely excluded female experiences. Her solution was to combine photography and painting. Artists, she observed, were forced to go outside the official Holocaust story to expose women's suffering. So, as you see here, in Double Jeopardy, the lower half of the work shows the widely circulated photograph of male inmates during liberation, while in the top half, she paints in women's traumatic encounters at liberation, where during liberation they were raped by German, Soviet, and American soldiers. So, in other words, gender specific torture. Chicago intended the raped women to allude to Rubens' rape of the Sabine women, in part to suggest that rape is a part of war. In this way, the men's activities would, in her words, the men's activities would thereby provide the historical context for the women's. This would be a metaphor for the fact that women are generally interpreted by the historical events that men orchestrate. It's a quote from Judy Chicago. Now, these forms of wartime mass rape were not only used to humiliate individual girls and women, but of course to destroy families and communities as well. These acts required significant planning. Combatants need to be brutalized, propaganda disseminated, abusive infrastructures marshaled, racial and other intercommunal hatreds drummed up. The personal harm of sexualized violence in armed conflicts is, of course, undeniable. But it's important to note that the destructive effects of sexual violence actually precedes any actual attack. In other words, the fear of rape constrains women's movements and may, for example, encourage parents to marry off their daughters at young ages in the mistaken belief that husbands will provide some kind of protection. In other circumstances, the victims of sexual violation are not even present at the moment of the violence. Children born of rape are stamped with a formidable stigma, often for life. For example, after the First World War, children born of rape by German troops in France were branded children of the barbarians. 1915, French commentators even suggested that sexual violation caused an indelible mark to be imprinted on the female organism, the effects of which make themselves felt as long as the reproducting function exists. So what this is saying is that the raped women's internal physiological environment would be permanently altered by her experience of sexual violation. In other words, children born years after the assault would possess the hereditary of the rapist, the shame of rape passing down multiple generations. More commonly, shame affected the victims themselves and the children born as a direct consequence. The example here might be during the Greek Civil War, 1944 to 49, where an unknown number of female political prisoners were raped and forced to give birth. The children were, of course, a visible proof of their shame. And this is a common motif when we're talking about these kinds of violence. After the conflict in Vietnam, for example, infants born as a result of rape by American soldiers were called children of the dust. In Bosnia, children of hate. In Kosovo, children of shame. In Rwanda, children of bad memories. And they were given names such as Little Killers, The Intruder, and I Am at a Loss. Now, the rejection of the offspring by their community, often on grounds that the child was a member of the paternal ethnic, so-called ethnic group, meant they lacked an identity, and in some places, including Croatia, denied citizenship. In other words, there's nothing private in incidents of mass rape during armed conflicts. It left long, long legacies. Rape was an intensely public display of brutality and was often simply an extension of other forms of extraordinary violence, such as the destruction of property, beatings, abductions, strip searches, torture, and murder. Wartime rape was also intrinsically political. Reports of rape had enormous value in terms of propaganda, especially when it involved victims who could be easily construed as innocent, young girls, for example. Rape stories routinely mobilized for both defensive and expansionist purposes. Obvious examples here during the First World War, rumors about the rape of the Hun were deliberately spread by Allied forces in an attempt to mobilize hatred and convince other nations, particularly America, to commit troops to the conflict. Best known example of this is James Bryce's report of the Committee on Alleged German Outrages, which was published in 1915, which testified to German atrocities, including mass rape of young girls and nuns. Similarly, in France, posters, pamphlets, newspaper articles repeatedly portrayed the invasion of Belgium and France in terms of sexual violation. The historian, the great historian, Ruth Harris, has noted that France, quote, became a frail and ravished jeune fille, weeping and broken on the floor as the cavalryman leaves the bedroom. As this suggests, mass rape has a symbolic value as an insult not only to the women and families, but an insult to the masculinity of the enemy. It was an indictment on these women's male citizens who had so patently failed to fulfill the unwritten gender contract that I mentioned earlier, under which men fight to protect women, who in turn provide them with nurturance. Now, wartime violence against girls and women was narrated very differently in different contexts. For example, the sexualized atrocities, torture carried out by Americans in Afghanistan and Iraq, for example, were discursively construed, and still are, by the way, discursively construed as examples of bad apples or the result of servicemen suffering from PTSD, while identical atrocities carried out by armed men from the geopolitical South were explained according to their alleged rapacious cultures. Such prejudices encourage colonialist attitudes not only towards the perpetrators, but also towards their victims. This has been really most eloquently expressed in Spivak's deservedly important phrase about white men protecting brown women from brown men, as well as being in line with the title of the wonderful book, Do Muslim Women Need Saving? As she argues in this book, too often white scholars, quote, present spectacular forms of violence in the global south as distinctive cultural practices, which in effect permits targeted audiences in the global north to feel innocent, moral, and purposeful. It was a debate that's been joined by a lot of other people, but also by African and Caribbean literary scholar Regine Michelle Jean Charles, when she reminded scholars about the need to present, quote, African women as advocates, survivors and agitators, rather than only as victims and vessels of violation. These women, she argues, were not passive female victims who had been subjected to countless violations in Africa's World War. These were not submissive receptacles of violence left for dead on the side of the road. These were not brutalized and victimized women in need of a Western vehicle to make their voices audible. They are subjects rather than objects in their own lives. So I guess my point here is that while so-called African sexual violence is positioned as part of African cultures, not so mass rapes and other atrocities carried out by, for example, American troops. An example of this, I think, can be seen by looking at the Winter Soldiers investigation in early 1971, when 109 American veterans, including some very, very highly decorated ones, testified to atrocities that they had committed during the conflict in Vietnam. These GIs provided a formidable list of reasons about why they had acted in atrocious ways, including racism, peer pressure, fear of being punished by comrades or senior officers, lack of training, environmental confusion, retaliation, revenge, failure of military leadership, trauma, war trauma, and so on and so on. The list of stresses goes on and on. What they don't mention is American culture. It goes without saying, perhaps, that there are serious problems with these excuses for atrocities against girls and women. And there's a number of reasons I say this, a number of problems. First is that they cannot explain the very high levels of sexual violence directed at their own side, directed by them at their own side. After all, a study of 558 American women who had served in Vietnam revealed that nearly half, 48%, of them had been subjected to personal violence by their male comrades, their own comrades, during that military service. 30% had been raped, 35% had been physically assaulted, and 16% had been both raped and physically assaulted. The second kind of problem with the argument is that the list of stresses becomes so long that atrocities very quickly become overdetermined. The veterans at the Winter Soldiers investigation repeatedly made claims that, quote, I think it's an atrocity on the part of the US Army, and don't ever let your government do this to you. In other words, the true victims, the tortured, the killed, effectively effaced, the real victims, the grunts, victims of US government policy. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not denying the reality of combat stresses. Indeed, I've written about them quite a lot, but I'm pointing to the additional role played by American culture in the atrocities perpetuated by members of the US military. In other words, when it came to sexual violence against Vietnamese and American girls and women, male service personnel were targeting a gender. In terms of rape murder of Vietnamese girls and women, they targeted an ethnicity as well as a gender. And this is not simply a fact in time, of armed conflict. The statistics from the US Army today are similarly appalling. So officially recognized statistics, which 100% underestimates, released by the Department of Veteran Affairs, found that 6% of servicewomen and 1% of servicemen had experienced sexual assault by their military comrades. During a congressional hearing not recently, in 2010, congressmen and women were informed that one quarter of female veterans using VA health services had been sexually assaulted while in service. 15% of service women in Iraq and Afghanistan reported having been sexually assaulted or harassed. In the words of one victim survivor, one of the problems over in Iraq for female soldiers is that there is a lot of sexual harassment and rape is high. And it doesn't matter if you're 18 or 58. Women serving over there don't have to worry about enemy fire. They have to be worried about the guy that's next to them, that's supposed to be protecting and taking care of them. And a lot of time he becomes like public enemy number one for them. My point is that if we are to understand why US servicemen commit atrocities in the field, we also must explore the willingness of them to commit them at home. Although sexual violence is clearly not simply a problem for the military, men who are attracted to armed cultures may, in fact, be more aggressive than many of their peers. There are also aspects of military culture, of course, that foster abuse. Aggression is rewarded, and cultures of domination, of course, are routine. Furthermore, there is very good reason why, or very good evidence, sorry, why many recruits to the US forces is good really good data that shows that many of them had sexually assaulted women prior to enlisting. The extent of such pre-military violence was revealed in some really amazing research carried out by researchers at the Naval Health Research Center, who surveyed 7,850 US naval recruits at the Navy Recruit Training Commands in Orlando, Florida, and Great Lakes, Illinois. What they discovered is that between 10 and 12% of recruits admitted committing rape prior to entering the Navy, and a further 2 to 4% reported attempting to rape a girl or woman. So, in other words, upon enlisting, these recruits simply were continuing abusive practices that they had done prior to the military experience. Now, the sense of crisis generated by such revelations exposes the starkly gendered cultures of harm within military settings, both military settings in wartime and in times of peace. But I think we can look much more broadly, much more broader than this. Clearly, the effects of all forms of violence in armed conflicts are gendered. Even if not targeted directly, girls and women, as well as the elderly, the disabled, other minoritized groups, are the main victims of collateral damage. The bombing of roads, the destruction of clean water supplies, blockades, which of course limit access to food and medical supplies, are particularly devastating to these groups. In the case of the war in Iraq, the public health disaster that killed tens of thousands of women and children were completely foreseeable. As one commentator put it, Iraq, bomb now, die later. Now, this move away, um, let's just move away now from this kind of violence to look more broadly, because the fourth argument I want to make here is that there's also gendered ways of enacting wartime violence. For example, on aircraft bases, women manned the sites while men launched the actual missiles. Major variations can be seen between cultures, between different cultures. Because, even though shortages of manpower gave every government compelling reasons to propel women into more active roles in wartime economies and even combat, ideology is playing a significant role in whether extending women's sphere of labor was facilitated or actually impeded. During the Second World War, for example, gendered assumptions help explain the reluctance of Japanese and German governments to fully militarize their female citizens. In Japan, for example, the mobilization of female labor was never compulsory. The number of Japanese women in employment increased only slightly in the course of the war. According to one estimate, the proportion of women in manufacturing and construction actually declined during that period. Gendered ideology meant that the Japanese government refused to compel women to work in factories, but it also encouraged them to introduce stringent regulations aimed at women's role as reproducers. In other words, producing the nation's babies. They outlawed birth control, for example, introduced incentives for women to have large families, and so on. As a result, in fact, Japanese women's economic and social roles changed very little during the war. And the opposite was the case in the Soviet Union, where there was a mass mobilization of women in frontline jobs in the winter of 1940, the winter of 1942 onwards. In total, around 500,000 Soviet women served in the Red Army's regular troops, and another 300,000 in combat and anti-aircraft formations on the home front. And for such women, there was no contradiction between their femininity and soldiering. They were not women donning masculine roles. They were women who were able to finally realize their hidden female talents. Finally, wartime violence challenges, of course, gender norms and practices. And this is obviously particularly important when faced with female perpetration of wartime violence. While it's often harder to see female perpetrators, they were, in fact, quite often hyper visible precisely because they confronted or confounded, I should say, gendered expectations. And these women participants were regarded as much worse than their male comrades in atrocities. They were not merely human, they were sexually monstrous. Now, again, to come back to something I mentioned earlier, I think that some of the most insightful responses to this are actually artistic ones. And I want to very briefly, in my concluding remarks, mention two here. The first is by the performance artist Coco Fusco, her A Room of One's Own, Women in Power in the New America, which is a powerful reflection on the violence perpetrated by women during the so-called War on Terror. The performance, if you don't know it, opens on a very large stage, furnished with podium, flanked by an American flag and two screens that you can see. One screen, PowerPoint presentation, projecting slogans, charts, photographs, drawings. The other is a simulated CCTV video of a male detainee wearing an orange jumpsuit in an interrogation room. During the speech, which is played by the artist herself as Sergeant Fusco, she would periodically leave the stage, bark out commands in the CCTV window that you see there. Her speech began by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, it was the great British writer Virginia Woolf who argued that every woman had to have a room of her own in order to manifest her strengths. At the onset of the new millennium, American women finally have what they need to demarcate their prowess. The war on terror offers an unprecedented opportunity for women of this country." She was, of course, referring to Woolf's classic essay, A Room of One's Own, which contended that to succeed in a male-dominated world, women needed money and a room of their own within which they could be truly productive. In Fusco's play, the abusive tactics advocated were those, of course, employed by American women in the detention centers during the War on Terror. At one stage during her stage speech, photographs of women wearing burqas appear alongside others of women with their faces uncovered, and these are appearing on that PowerPoint screen. These images prompted Sergeant Fusco to inform her argument that one of our principal goals in bringing democracy to Afghanistan has been to liberate Afghan women. So it's a play, of course, on Spivak's famous quip mentioned earlier. Sergeant Fusco maintained that the strategic deployment of female interrogators represents a great leap for womankind. Her performance was a stark warning, of course, of the potential misapplication of equality feminism. It gives women the equal right to sexually abuse, torture, and kill members of enemy groups. So she's encouraging women, if you like, to reflect on their complicity in perpetrating violence on people elsewhere in the world. I was going to mention these two others, but I'm not going to, so you can have a look at them. Martha Rosler's House Beautiful, Bringing the War Home, which she did during the Vietnam War, and then, of course, during the War on Terror. Let me just conclude in the next 2 minutes. I want to return to Phyllis Kelly, whose letter I quoted at the start of this talk. her awful clutching fear at her heart when she contemplated her lover's death, I think does give us something to reflect upon. It encourages us to think about our own positionality when researching, thinking about, and writing about war and the politics of gender. My title says Gender and the Politics of Wartime Violence, but we could turn it around to place more emphasis on the politics of gender and the way it facilitates, inspires, and enables violence. Today, I've spoken about militarism in the context of women and girls, since that was my brief. But since this conference is about children as well as women, I want to conclude with just very brief reflections on what I think is a really critical comment by cultural and literary commentator George Steiner. He's reflecting on the Holocaust, and he writes, "At moments when I see my children in the room or imagine that I hear them breathing in the still of the house, I grow afraid, because I have put on their backs a burden of ancient loathing and set savagery on their heels, because it may be that I will be able to do no more than the parents of the dead children to guard them." Similar words might have been said or may be said by parents today in Gaza or the Ukraine, to take two examples. Historians like myself have been taught to look at documents from the past with analytical eyes, mute ears, cool hearts. There is no room of our own in which to sit and shiver with such an awful clutching fear in our hearts. A decade ago, I read a book called Fear, A Cultural History, in which I observed that people in terrible, life-threatening situations turn time and again to one question: what does it mean to be human? Sometimes they answered that question in violent, damning ways. Wars and other conflicts typically start in fear and panic. But at other times, their answers to that question spurred them to engagement with other frightened or oppressed peoples. This surely is one of the aims of us getting together here today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Joanna, for this wonderful presentation that has exposed so many ideas, so many topics, so many ways to reflect around the relationship between war, violence, sexual violence. I assume that the public hearing us has many questions and many ideas and many comments, but since I am the one sitting here, I'm going to take advantage of that and making a couple of comments of my own interest, which I am going to take advantage of again, since you are one of the main experts on these topics, and I would like to comment it with you. You have, I have like two different comments. You have mainly about conceptual and methodological approaches, but which I think that they are really connected with what you have been talking about in the last 40 minutes. First of all is this like conceptual debate around the idea of rape or sexual violence, let's say, more broadly, as a weapon of war. You have, I think, clearly, and if not, correct me, clearly presented that rape is, or sexual violence is kind of something inherent to military cultures and to war cultures, at least, let's say, in contemporary wars, if not talking about other eras that we could also reflect. But, and in this sense, some authors have like kind of denied or have not really go along with the idea of rape as a weapon of war, in the sense that they argue that it is not something explicitly told to soldiers. So in that sense, in some contexts, for example, the Spanish Civil War, so in that sense, we cannot talk about a weapon of war, but about a practice that it is kind of fostered, let's say, or helped due to the context. So I am not agree with this idea, but I would like to know what you think about that. And a second comment, very brief, is about how we as historians can methodologically approach this really complex phenomena of sexual violences, let's say in plural now, because you have talked about shame, and you have briefly mentioned that you are not really, and I know that because I have heard you talk about this in other places, about you are not very comfortable with the category of victim, and I would say that in a way, if we always use this, and I can agree with that, if we always use this category of victim, we are just labeling or defining a person just for one single episode of her life or his life. Obviously, there's sexual violence also against male. And how can we try to understand the complexities? How can we address as historians or as social scientists this phenomena, trying at the same time not to define people just for this thing that happened to them. For example, also taking into account how we manage the personal data in our books, in our articles, about people that maybe their families do not know about what happened to their grandmother or their grandfather, but then they can read your book and they can discover that it was a truly different story about what they heard from their own relatives. So how can we manage to deal with all these methodological, I think, challenges in such a complex topic?
Wow, those are amazing, amazing questions. Thanks very much. I'll take them in turn. Rape as a weapon of war. I think it's been a very useful way of talking about rape in certain military conflicts, the former Yugoslavia being a very obvious example of that, but not the only one, where there's deliberate, where sexual violence is written in to strategy. It's written in to the way you destroy entire communities and indeed entire worlds, if you like. So it's been an incredibly productive way of thinking. And I think we should continue to use it in those contexts. I think it's become overused and it's being used in contexts where it shouldn't be. In other words, not all rape in war is using sexual violence as a weapon of war. And I'm saying that for a number of reasons. First, that rape as a weapon of war, I think, should be used when it is a strategic decision by senior military or by military commanders to destroy cultures. So much of sexual violence in wartime becomes invisible if that's the only use we make of it, because so much does not fit into that strategy. So much is opportunistic. So much is simply a continuation of what men do in peacetime, as I argued in terms of American soldiers in Vietnam and Afghanistan. It's just a continuation. It also it obscures the opportunistic, the everyday, the fact that sexual violence in wartime is not only a soldier against the enemy, it's also within communities. So we see within communities, for example, in Rwanda, in Croatia, that sexual violence increases within families, within people on the same side, is what I'm saying here. Because, and there's many reasons for that, a huge number of reasons for that. Some of those reasons is continuation of what they do anyway in peacetime. Some of it is because there's often the destruction of law enforcement, so there's no consequences to be held. There are lots of reasons for that, and also those stresses that I mentioned earlier. So I guess my point is, I think we need to use it in cases where it is a strategic decision, and we must note that sexual violence in wartime is bigger than that. You mentioned that sexual violence is inherent in war cultures. Yes, it is. I do argue that. I think we just need to be a little bit, I need to be, sorry, a little bit careful just to always acknowledge that it doesn't have to be that way. So in other words, there are some war cultures that don't have high levels of sexual violence. And I think one of the things I would like to see a lot more work done about is how can we explain military cultures, how can we explain wars where actually sexual violence is low? And what can that teach us? What can that tell us about sexual violence? That's the first comment. Shame. I think there are I've spent a lot of time in the past decade or so worrying about the ethics of what I do. And ethical questions are political questions. And what that means lots of different things, but what I want it to mean precisely right now is that it means that there's no necessary right answer for these questions. They are political questions about how we address people in the past. Shame is something that is a huge thing for people who have experienced sexual violence, and that's obvious. As historians, as social scientists, as people in the humanities, as general people, I think we need to try and move that shame argument to the people who commit the acts as opposed to those who don't. Those who suffer the acts, experience these acts of violence. I've thought long and hard, and I've changed my mind many times about the use of the word victim. And a lot of people, and survivor, and of course perpetrator, a lot of victims don't survive. A lot of survivors don't see themselves as victims. The survivor discourse has in the recent past very much come from an American context. I think the decision I try to follow as much as I can is to talk about people who act in these ways or people who experience certain things. Sometimes we need the shorthand of this is a perpetrator, this is a victim, because otherwise you just it gets a bit too wordy. But I do try as much as I can to talk about people who've experienced something or people who have acted in a particular way, as opposed to labeling them with these terms. And about how we manage personal data is a really difficult one. On the one hand, naming people in the past who may not want to be named, I think we need to be really, really sensitive to that. On the other hand, that does come back to this question of shame. They shouldn't be ashamed. They may be ashamed, in which case we shouldn't use their names, but there should be no shame attached to having experienced a particular form of violence. And I keep pushing that line as much as possible. But thanks. I think the ethical issues are things we really need to think about a lot more. We being people like me who are an historian, people like yourself who work in these fields.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I think we can open the discussion to the public. Si alguien quiere.
So if you have questions from the audience, please do not hesitate.
I have more questions if that is not the case, but someone will want to, yeah. But I think, well, you cannot, since you are only looking at me, I'm sorry for that. But Professor José Manuel Núñez Seixas, who I think you know, he's going to pose a question.
Hi, Joanna. Nice to see you on the screen. I still remember we met last year in Denia at the Humanities Festival, and we discussed about some related topics. And well, actually, I'm wondering whether you could expand a little bit more on the attitudes of female soldiers towards rape and abuses, sexual abuses committed by their comrades in arms against or having enemy female soldiers or female civilians as victims. Right, because I mean, you mentioned at the end of your presentation that the issue of female perpetrators is an open field. I have the impression that this is a taboo in memory politics and the politics of remembrance. I'm particularly acquainted with the memories of the Red Army in the Second World War, and I mean, you know, the issue of mass rapes committed by Red Army soldiers in Eastern Germany, etc. However, and yet, how female soldiers of the Red Army reacted to their comrades raping German women, or not only German women, still remains a relatively unknown phenomenon. I mean, even Svetlana Alexievich, in her wonderful book on the war has not a womanly face, or something like that. I mean, I don't remember the title of the English translation, has actually, my view, not really addressed this issue, which is obviously a very uncomfortable one. I mean, how do you feel about that? I mean, do you think that what was more important in war for female soldiers when confronted with the ethical issue of seeing their comrades raping enemy women? What was prevalent, gender solidarity or national solidarity or comradeship, a certain distorted concept of comradeship? Thank you very much.
That is a really important question. And firstly, the context I've been looking at, I've found very little commentary by the people I work on, the women I work on, about their responses to this. The one big exception to this, sorry, there's two exceptions to this actually. One exception is the Winter Soldier investigation, which is an incredible source. It's all online, by the way. All the transcripts and everything are online. Incredible source, because there were also some women who gave evidence during that event, and they only allude to it in very subtle ways. And in ways of gender solidarity. So in other words, gender trumped the nationalistic thing. But we have to remember that these are a very unusual, unrepresentative group of people, both men and women, who are testifying during that commission. What is very interesting in the Winter Soldiers investigation is the Black soldiers, African American male soldiers, who comment on it all the time as being something that was particularly appalling, and something they couldn't understand, and something that led them away from the army, severely disillusioned them. Sexual violence seems to be something that the African American men talk about all the time. Now, this may be, of course, because the men who were carrying out acts of sexual violence tended not to do it when the women were present, whereas the African American men were present when they were doing those things to Vietnamese women. So that probably does explain why that happened. But I still think it's very interesting. The other occasion where the main occasion where you get female soldiers confronting sexual violence in the military is when they are confronting it vis-a-vis their own comrades. So we have this massive amount of material of complaints and extended, quite lengthy documents where women describe how their female comrades are being sexually assaulted or being sexually harassed. That is a really big thing. And that carries on, so I've got evidence from that from the Second World War onwards, particularly, of course, from Vietnam and Korea, war in Korea onwards. But also, I've done actually a lot of work on this topic, on military sexual trauma, as it's known in the literature, in terms of the 21st century. And indeed, my Shame project had a whole section on military sexual trauma today. And one of the things that was so incredible was just how many serving female soldiers were reporting this. And there was a big commission in Britain a few years ago, Royal Commission, where the British government, for the first time, the army, so it was a government commission, but the army for the first time gave female women the freedom to talk in public about what had happened to them. And it generated a massive proportion of women in the military responded to that. Something like a quarter of all serving women responded and told their story about sexual harassment and sexual violence within the British services. So, and that was just extraordinary. It took everyone by shock, to be blunt about it. But really, really, I think it's a really important topic.
Gracias, profesora.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the translation, for the excellent translation into Spanish. My question, I don't know if it's a question or a reaffirmation. I have read many of your books about the victims of the Second World War, and well, as a member of Triángulo Azul, Triángulo Blau, and the Buchengal Friends Group. So I have visited the camps, the concentration camps recently, the Majdanek extermination camps, as well as the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camps, and I've seen how crime aims at ensuring the humiliation of victims. In the Auschwitz Museum, the clothing of the babies killed by the SS is exposed. Pregnant women were sent straight away to the gas chamber. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for the research that you have carried out, because it is sometimes interesting to see how evil has no limits. And here comes my remark or my question. The question is, Preston also speaks about the Spanish Holocaust, referring to the victims from Extremadura. So, of course, rape was a regular practice, very cruel rapes against women, against men, against girls. And this has an explanation. I really applaud and commend that you are digging into this history, but also from a philosophical lens, from an ethical perspective, from political science, etc. So the question would be about child soldiers. They are victims, but at a given time they become perpetrators to scale up in this evil pyramid. What is the solution to this? And what is the future ahead? because it seems like humanity is going down the wrong way. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thanks very, very much. I mean, um, as you're aware, there's some fantastic work done, particularly in various African states that look at children who are kidnapped sexually and abused in a huge range of ways, which sexual is probably not the worst, actually, and become integrated into as a survival mechanism and then commit atrocities themselves. And that has been called the gray zone by some people who work in that field, where the sense of agency is so removed that survival itself depends on acting in these particular ways. I've actually done to talk about that in the Disgrace book. More recently, though, in my book, Evil Women, which was mentioned in the introduction, which is now in press, it will be out soon. I actually address those issues even more directly in the context of women, and it could be men, the gender in this case doesn't actually make a difference. It does make a difference, but it's not relevant to the question. These are women who have committed extremely violent, aggressive acts of sexual abuse and murder multiple times. And I look at them and I look at their lives, and someone like me who has been working in this field for such a long time, even I have to admit to being absolutely appalled by I can only call it torture of nearly, not all, nearly all of their childhoods. So the sort of cycle of violence that is established, I think is a very real thing, and a real deep problem, because it calls into question the sort of individualistic nature of just so-called justice systems, which look at what someone has done, absolutely horrific crimes of unbelievable violence, and take it out of its context, if you like, and the responsibility of people in society more generally, or those teachers, those nurses, those neighbors, those friends around, who saw and knew what was happening and just let these children be tortured. So that is one of the things I'm particularly interested in, and linked to that, and linked to, I think, the questions we're talking about more broadly is, well, what do we do with people who have experienced horrific violence and then who commit horrific violence? And this links into very much my sort of anti-carceral feminism approach. So carceral feminism is surprisingly dominant right now. Carceral feminism is you throw them in prison and you throw away the key. Lock them in prison, throw away the key. So, but how can someone who wants to look at that broader concept, who wants to look at transformative justice for people, how should we deal with these people? So I don't think that's an adequate answer, but it's the only one I have. I'm sorry. The future for humanity. I'm an optimist because, and that's why I'm an historian. I believe that very strongly that things weren't always this way, and therefore they can get better. But it will take the labor of every person, whatever our proclivities, whatever our spheres of influence. This is a major task for all of us. But I do, if we just say this is part of what it means to be human, what we're really doing, or that it's inevitable, What we're really doing is throwing our hands in the air and allowing and becoming complicit ourselves in the suffering, in the violence. And so, this idea that actually what it means to be human is to resist. What it means to be human is to seek friendship, love, companionship, communion with other human beings. Then that's what we ought to be. That's where our energy should go, rather than throwing our hands in the air. But of course, that's no easy task, and particularly when we see what's happening in Gaza and other places around the world today, that's a real challenge for each of us.
Well, okay. The organizers are doing me this sign, just to cut. Since you are not looking at them, I'm going to translate also this. No, I think this has been a really wonderful discussion. I'm really happy that you managed to be here, although it's online. I think we have all really enjoyed, and we will continue to keep up with all your work and all your publications, which are like a huge amount of them. So I think that we could end this with a round of applause for the session. So many thanks, Professor Bourke.
And can I also have a round of applause for the translators and everyone who helped organize this, because I know I messed you up by being unable, for reasons beyond my control, to be there. So also a round of applause for all of you people as well. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.